The deaths in Afghanistan come at a time when a new report questions Australia's military strategy in our region. The report, commissioned by the Lowy Institute and written by a US Army colonel, concludes that our defence strategy is out of touch with regional security risks and recommends high-end military projects be reconsidered. Professor Alan Dupont is a visiting fellow of the Lowy Institute and works at the Centre for International Security Studies at Sydney University. He joins us now. So, Professor Dupont, before we get to the defence strategy report, I'd just like to ask you about the latest Australian casualties in Afghanistan and the fact that one Australian digger has died at the hands of an Afghan soldier he'd been training and trusting. That must be very worrying for our Defence Force effort there.
Well, it is very worrying, but and a great tragedy for the ADF that this has happened. But I'd like to point out that this is not the first time this kind of incident has happened with coalition forces in Afghanistan. The Taliban are deliberately trying to plant their own people within the army and the police to do exactly this, to undermine the morale of the coalition forces. Unfortunately, sometimes they'll be successful. This is the first time it's happened to the Australian diggers in 6 years, but I don't think it will be the last time.
And this is going to be a huge blow to morale on the ground.
Well, it will be, particularly when you've been working closely and training the Afghan army as the Australian soldiers have. But as I point out, it's the first time it has happened to the Australian forces in Afghanistan, and we've probably got out of this fairly lightly so far when you think about the casualties that the Germans and the Dutch and the Americans have taken from rogue soldiers like this. So I'm afraid this is part of the dirty war that's being fought in Afghanistan.
Let's talk now then about that report written for the Lowy Institute by US Army Colonel John Angevine. He says we're too busy preparing for large-scale conflicts in our region that are simply unlikely to happen. Do you have any sympathy with that view?
Well, without having seen the full report, it's a bit difficult to make a comprehensive comment, but just to take up that point, I don't really agree with the proposition that we are only structured for high-end warfare and that we're going it alone, as he claims. I would say that the Australian Defence Force has been deliberately structured to work effectively with the Americans and with other coalition forces. So we very rarely do things on our own. Most of the conflicts we've been engaged in over the last 20 years, we have been working closely with coalition partners. So I'm not quite sure the point that he's actually making there.
But if the threats to Australia aren't large-scale, then what are they, briefly?
Well, the Australian Defence Force is structured for a range of contingencies, everything from the Afghanistan-Iraqi conflicts we've been involved in through to humanitarian intervention and support operations in our own backyard in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. So there are a range of tasks, and we need to have the flexibility to do all those things. And I think that we've more or less got the balance right. I take the point that perhaps some of the acquisitions we've been made, like submarines, we need to look at again, because I personally agree with Colonel Angevine that 12 submarines, for example, may be a little bit too much for what we want. So there are legitimate reasons for questioning our current structure, but I don't think he's actually got it right in saying that we're too structured for high-end contingencies and that we seek to go it alone. I don't think that's the case.
Professor Alan Dupont, thank you.
My pleasure.